Winter did not arrive gently in northern China in the early 13th century. It settled in with a quiet severity, frost hardening the earth, rivers slowing into sheets of dull ice, and the wind carrying with it a stillness that felt almost deliberate. In that stillness, cities endured, walls stood, armies waited. Administrations continued to function as they always had, guided by systems that had survived for generations. And yet, beneath that apparent stability, something had already begun to collapse. Not suddenly, not visibly, but with a kind of structural inevitability that only becomes clear in hindsight. By the year 1233, the Jin Dynasty, once a dominant power in northern China, was no longer facing conventional enemy. What approached its capital was not merely an army, but a method, a way of war that did not rely on overwhelming force alone, but on pressure applied precisely, patiently, and often invisibly until resistance ceased to function. Kaifeng, the provisional capital of Jin, stood at the center of that pressure. The city itself had not been designed as a last refuge. It had been chosen out of necessity. Earlier capitals had already fallen, one by one, to a force that did not behave according to the expectations of traditional warfare. When the Jin court relocated southward to Kaifeng, it was not an act of confidence, but containment, an attempt to hold together what remained. But containment requires time, and time was no longer something the Jin possessed. The origins of the crisis lay not in a single defeat, but in a gradual narrowing of options. For decades, the Jin Dynasty had governed a vast territory stretching across northern China. Its administration was complex, layered, and often resilient under stress. But it was also dependent on stability, on the predictable movement of grain, the loyalty of regional commanders, and the assumption that threats would emerge in recognizable forms. The Mongols did not conform to those assumptions. Their rise under a unified command had already transformed the political landscape of Inner Asia. But more importantly, it had introduced a form of coordination that earlier steppe confederations had failed to sustain. Campaigns were no longer isolated raids. They were sequences, planned, adjusted, and executed across multiple fronts with a consistency that eroded the Jin's ability to respond effectively. Cities that had once relied on their walls found themselves isolated instead of protected. Supply routes became liabilities. Reinforcements arrived too late, or not at all. Communication slowed, fragmented, and in many cases ceased entirely. What the Jin faced was not simply invasion, but disconnection. Kaifeng, by the time it became the focal point of resistance, was already under strain. Its population had swelled rapidly. Refugees from fallen territories moved southward, bringing with them not only their possessions but their fears, their account of destruction, and their uncertainty about what remained ahead. The city's infrastructure, its storage systems, its administrative capacity, its ability to regulate food and maintain order, was pushed beyond what it had been designed to sustain. Grain reserves, once sufficient, began to diminish under pressure of increased demand. Prices rose. Distribution became uneven. Markets continued to function, but with a growing tension beneath their surface, a recognition that supply was no longer guaranteed. Inside the court, decisions became increasingly constrained. There were no simple options left. To abandon Kaifeng would mean relinquishing the last significant administrative center still under Jin control. To remain was to risk encirclement. To attempt open battle against a force that had repeatedly demonstrated superior mobility and coordination would expose the dynasty's remaining military strength to decisive defeat. And so, the decision that emerged was not one of confidence, but of necessity. They would hold the city. Holding a city, however, is not a passive act. It requires preparation, not only of walls and gates, but of systems. Supplies must be rationed. Defenses must be organized. Command structures must remain intact under pressure. Most importantly, morale must be maintained, not through declarations, but through the visible functioning of authority. At Kaifeng, those preparations were undertaken with urgency. Walls were reinforced. Watchtowers were manned continuously. Units were assigned to specific sections of the defenses, with responsibilities clearly defined to prevent confusion during an attack. The city's gates became focal points of control, monitored, regulated, and in many cases restricted to prevent disorder. But preparation cannot compensate for isolation. By late 1232 and into 1233, the Mongol presence around Kaifeng was no longer intermittent. It had become sustained. Surrounding territories were systematically stripped of resources. Agricultural lands were disrupted. Villages that might have provided support or warning were either abandoned or absorbed into the advancing network of control. The effect was cumulative. Kaifeng did not fall into siege all at once. It was drawn into it. What made this process particularly destabilizing for the Jin was its lack of clear boundaries. Traditional siege warfare followed a recognizable pattern. An army would arrive, establish positions, and attempt to breach defenses through force or attrition. The defenders, in turn, would respond with countermeasures, repairs, sorties, or attempts to break the encirclement. But what developed around Kaifeng did not conform to that pattern. The Mongol approach emphasized flexibility. Positions shifted. Pressure points changed. Instead of committing entirely to a single line of attack, the encirclement adapted, tightening where resistance weakened, loosening where direct confrontation offered little advantage. This created uncertainty within the city. Commanders could not predict where the next major engagement would occur. Resources had to be distributed across multiple potential threats, reducing the effectiveness of concentrated defense. Soldiers remained on constant alert, but without a clear sense of when or where decisive action would be required. Fatigue, under such conditions, does not emerge from battle alone. It emerges from anticipation. Within the Jin court, the psychological weight of the situation became increasingly evident. Reports arrived irregularly, often incomplete, sometimes contradictory. Attempts to coordinate relief efforts from outside the city faced logistical obstacles that could not be easily overcome. Distances that had once been manageable became impassable under the pressure of Mongol movement. Allies were uncertain. Communication lines were unreliable. Decisions had to be made with partial information. In such an environment, hesitation becomes as dangerous as error. Some within the court advocated for negotiation, a recognition that the balance of power had shifted beyond recovery. Others argued for continued resistance, emphasizing the symbolic importance of holding the capital, even under deteriorating conditions. Neither position offered a clear path to survival. Negotiation required leverage that no longer existed. Resistance required resources that were steadily diminishing. The result was a form of strategic paralysis, not an absence of decision, but a narrowing of decisions to choices between unfavorable outcomes. Outside the walls, the Mongol forces continued to operate with a discipline that reflected their broader strategic framework. They did not rely solely on direct assault. Instead, they integrated multiple forms of pressure, military, economic, and psychological, into a unified approach. Supply lines were targeted not just to disrupt immediate needs, but to create long-term instability. Movements were coordinated to prevent the formation of external relief forces. Information was controlled, limiting the defenders' ability to assess the broader situation. This was not a siege designed to end quickly. It was designed to make endurance itself unsustainable. As winter deepened, the conditions within Kaifeng grew more severe. Food shortages became more pronounced. Rationing systems were adjusted, but could not fully compensate for the imbalance between supply and demand. The quality of available provisions declined. Substitutions were made, first reluctantly, then out of necessity. For soldiers stationed on the walls, the physical demands of defense were compounded by these shortages. Cold, hunger, and exhaustion do not operate independently. They reinforce one another. A soldier weakened by insufficient food is less capable of maintaining vigilance. Reduced vigilance increases vulnerability. Increased vulnerability requires greater effort to compensate, which in turn accelerates fatigue. This cycle does not break easily, and within the confined environment of a besieged city, it becomes increasingly difficult to escape. Yet, despite these conditions, Kaifeng did not collapse immediately. The structures of governance remained in place. Orders continued to be issued. Defenses were maintained. There was no single moment at which the city ceased to function. Instead, what developed was a gradual erosion. Each day, the margin for error became smaller. Each decision carried greater consequences. Each loss, whether supplies, personnel, or information, had a cumulative effect that could not be easily reversed. The defenders were not unaware of this. They understood that time was no longer neutral. It was working against them. And beyond the walls, the strategy that had brought them to this point was still unfolding, not through sudden breakthroughs or dramatic confrontations, but through a steady application of pressure that left little room for recovery. The Siege of Kaifeng was not yet decided, but the conditions under which it would be decided were already in place. And within those conditions, every choice, every hesitation, every commitment would carry consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the city. By the time the Siege of Kaifeng tightened into its final phase, the balance between the two sides was no longer measured in numbers alone. It was measured in structure. The Jin Dynasty still possessed an army, organized, trained, and accustomed to defending fortified positions. Within Kaifeng, units remained disciplined despite the strain. Commanders continued to issue orders with clarity, maintaining a chain of authority that had not yet broken. On the surface, the mechanisms of defense were intact, but beyond the walls, the opposing force operated under a different logic. The Mongol command structure did not depend on the city's collapse in a single decisive engagement. It functioned as a coordinated system, multiple commanders operating within a shared strategic framework, capable of adjusting their movements without losing cohesion. Orders did not need to be rigid. They needed to be understood. And they were. The Mongol forces surrounding Kaifeng were not static. Encampments shifted with intention. Cavalry units moved in controlled arcs beyond the visible perimeter, intercepting any attempt at communication or reinforcement. Smaller detachments monitored routes that might otherwise have been overlooked, river crossings, secondary roads, and narrow supply paths that had once connected the capital to its hinterland. The result was not a single line of encirclement, but a layered one. From the walls of Kaifeng, defenders could see activity, movement, regrouping, patrols, but not its full pattern. What appeared as scattered positioning was, in reality, a system designed to eliminate uncertainty for those outside the city, while preserving it for those within. This asymmetry shaped every decision the Jin commanders were forced to make. Inside Kaifeng, the defensive structure was organized with precision, but constrained by necessity. The city's walls, though formidable, were not designed to withstand prolonged isolation without external support. Their strength lay in resistance to direct assault. Thick masonry, elevated towers, and defensive platforms capable of supporting archers and early gunpowder weapons. Jin forces had access to technologies that could, under different circumstances, alter the outcome of a siege. Gunpowder-based weapons, bombs, fire lances, and explosive projectiles were deployed along key sections of the wall. These were not experimental devices, but established components of Jin military practice. In close engagements, they could disrupt advancing troops, create confusion, and inflict concentrated damage. But these weapons required coordination, and coordination, under conditions of constant pressure and limited resources, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The Mongols understood this limitation. They did not rush the walls. Instead, they approached the siege as a process of controlled engagement. Probing attacks tested specific sections of the defenses, not with the intention of immediate breach, but to observe response times, resource allocation, and patterns of reinforcement. Each engagement provided information, where defenders concentrated their forces, how quickly they responded, which sections of the wall showed signs of strain, not structurally, but operationally. This information was not wasted. It was integrated into subsequent actions, refining the pressure applied to the city. For the soldiers defending Kaifeng, this created a battlefield that was both constant and uncertain. There were no clear phases of combat. Instead, there were moments, sudden escalations that demanded immediate response, followed by periods of relative stillness that offered no guarantee of rest. A section of the wall might come under attack at dawn, only for the pressure to shift to another area by midday. Commanders were forced to distribute their forces across the entire perimeter, reducing their ability to concentrate strength where it might be most effective. This dilution was not accidental. It was induced. Beyond direct engagement, the environment itself became a factor in the unfolding conflict. Winter conditions continued to affect both sides, but not equally. The Mongol army, accustomed to operating across vast and often harsh terrains, maintained mobility even in cold conditions. Their logistical system, less dependent on fixed supply lines, more adaptable to local conditions, allowed them to sustain pressure without overextending. Within Kaifeng, the situation was different. Every resource was finite: fuel for warmth, food for sustenance, materials for repair. Each had to be managed carefully. The strain on these resources increased with every passing day, not only because of consumption, but because of the demands of defense. Damaged sections of the wall required immediate attention. Equipment had to be maintained. Soldiers needed to be rotated, even if only briefly, to prevent complete exhaustion. But rotation requires surplus, and surplus no longer existed. Leadership, under these conditions, became a test not of authority, but of endurance. Jin commanders were not inexperienced. Many had served in previous campaigns, understood the principles of siege warfare, and recognized the importance of maintaining order under pressure. But the situation at Kaifeng was not one they had been trained to resolve. There was no external relief force approaching with certainty, no strategic reserve that could be deployed to break the encirclement. Every decision had to be made with the understanding that resources would not be replenished. This awareness shaped their choices. Engagements were measured. Risk was calculated conservatively. The priority was not victory in a single confrontation, but the preservation of the defensive structure for as long as possible. But preservation, in this context, was itself a diminishing objective. The Mongol commanders, by contrast, operated with a broader strategic horizon. The Siege of Kaifeng was not an isolated objective. It was part of a larger campaign aimed at eliminating the Jin Dynasty as a functioning power. The fall of the city would not only remove a defensive position, but dismantle the administrative core that sustained resistance. This allowed for patience. There was no immediate need to force a breach at high cost. Time, already working against the defenders, could be leveraged further. Pressure could be applied incrementally, allowing internal conditions of the city to deteriorate without requiring continuous large-scale assaults. This approach reduced risk. It preserved manpower, and it maintained initiative. Yet, despite this calculated restraint, direct confrontations did occur. At intervals, Mongol forces advanced toward the walls in coordinated attacks, testing not only the physical defenses, but the readiness of the defenders. Siege equipment was brought forward, not in overwhelming numbers, but in sufficient quantity to challenge specific points. These engagements were not intended to end the siege. They were intended to shape it. Each attack forced the Jin defenders to commit resources, ammunition, manpower, attention, to a particular section. Even when the attacks were repelled, they achieved their purpose by drawing strength away from other areas, creating new vulnerabilities. For the soldiers on the walls, these moments were intense but brief. Explosive projectiles were launched downward. Arrows filled the air. Fire weapons ignited sections of the battlefield, creating zones of heat and confusion in the cold winter environment. Then, just as quickly, the attackers would withdraw, leaving behind damage that had to be repaired, and uncertainty about where the next engagement would occur. Over time, this pattern began to have a cumulative effect. Defensive responses slowed, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Units took longer to reposition. Coordination between sections of the wall became less precise. Communication, already strained, showed signs of fragmentation. These were not failures of discipline. They were indicators of fatigue. And fatigue, once it reaches a certain threshold, cannot be reversed through command alone. Within the city, the civilian population was no longer separate from the battlefield. Shortages affected everyone. The distinction between soldier and civilian blurred as resources became scarce. Labor was redirected toward maintaining defenses. Individuals who had not been part of the military structure found themselves contributing to the effort, repairing walls, transporting materials, assisting in the distribution of limited supplies. This integration increased the city's capacity to resist, but it also increased the cost of continued resistance. Every day the siege continued. The strain extended deeper into the social structure of Kaifeng. By early 1233, the siege had entered a phase where the outcome was no longer dependent on a single decisive event. It depended on accumulation, the accumulation of pressure, the accumulation of shortages, the accumulation of fatigue. The Jin forces continued to hold their positions. The walls remained standing. Command structures had not collapsed, but the conditions sustaining those structures were eroding. And beyond the walls, the strategy that had created those conditions remained consistent, measured, adaptive, and increasingly difficult to counter. The battlefield of Kaifeng was not defined by a single clash of armies. It was defined by a system of engagement that extended across time, space, and the limits of endurance. And within that system, the margin between resistance and collapse was narrowing with each passing day. By the opening months of 1233, the Siege of Kaifeng had reached a point where the visible structures of resistance still existed, but the conditions sustaining them no longer did. The walls stood. The banners of the Jin still marked the towers. Orders were still issued, recorded, and obeyed. But beneath that continuity, the system had begun to fail in ways that could not be reversed. Not through courage, not through discipline, and not through time. The turning point did not arrive as a single moment of rupture. It emerged gradually, through a shift in what the defenders were capable of doing. Food shortages, once manageable through rationing, became critical. The substitution of inferior provisions gave way to the absence of provisions altogether. Storage systems that had once buffered the city against disruption were now exhausted. Distribution, no longer a matter of organization, became a matter of limitation. There was no longer enough. This altered the nature of decision-making inside the city. Commanders could still plan defensive actions. They could still reposition units, respond to attacks, and maintain the appearance of control. But the physical condition of their soldiers no longer matched the demands being placed upon them. Strength diminished, reaction slowed, and most importantly, the ability to sustain effort over time collapsed. For soldiers on the walls, the experience of defense changed. Where earlier they had faced alternating periods of engagement and recovery, recovery itself became incomplete. Rest did not restore strength. Hunger was not relieved. Cold, no longer countered by sufficient fuel or nutrition, penetrated deeper into the body. A soldier could still stand, still hold position, but endurance, the ability to maintain effectiveness across excessive engagements, was no longer reliable. This introduced unpredictability into the defensive system, not at the level of command, but at the level of execution. Orders were understood. They were not always fulfilled with the same precision. The Mongol commanders recognized this shift. Their strategy from the beginning had not depended on immediate victory. It had depended on identifying the point at which the defender's capacity to function would degrade beyond recovery. By early 1233, that point was approaching, and the nature of their engagement began to adjust accordingly. Pressure increased, not through reckless assault, but through more frequent, more targeted actions. Sections of the wall that had shown signs of slower response were tested again. Probing attacks became sharper, more deliberate. The objective was no longer observation. It was confirmation. At the same time, the isolation of Kaifeng reached its final stage. External relief, once a possibility, however uncertain, ceased to be a factor entirely. Communication lines had been severed not just physically, but operationally. There were no longer reliable channels through which assistance could be coordinated. The city was no longer part of a broader strategic network. It had become a closed system, and within that system, resources were no longer being replenished. Inside Kaifeng, the effects of this isolation extended beyond the military. Civilian life, already strained, began to collapse in parallel. Markets no longer functioned in any meaningful sense. The mechanisms of exchange, currency, pricing, regulation, became irrelevant in the absence of goods. Social order, while not immediately breaking, became increasingly fragile as the basic conditions required to sustain it disappeared. Labor, once organized around administration and commerce, shifted entirely toward survival. Effort was no longer directed toward maintaining the structure of the city. It was directed toward enduring its conditions. Within the Jin court, the remaining options narrowed to a final set of decisions. None of them offered preservation of the dynasty as it had existed. To continue resistance meant prolonging the suffering within the city, without a clear path to reversal. To seek terms of surrender required acknowledgement that the political structure the court represented could no longer be sustained. These were not decisions made in isolation. They were shaped by the recognition that the siege had already determined its outcome. What remained was the manner in which that outcome would unfold. Beyond the walls, the Mongol forces maintained their position with discipline. There was no need for urgency. The system they had established was functioning as intended. The defenders were no longer capable of altering the balance. And so, the final phase of the siege did not accelerate into chaos. It tightened. When the decisive collapse came, it did not resemble a dramatic breach. There was no singular moment in which the walls fell and the city was overwhelmed in a single surge. Instead, the collapse occurred through a breakdown of coordination. Defensive responses, already slowed, became inconsistent. Sections of the wall could no longer support one another effectively. Gaps, operational rather than structural, began to appear. These gaps were exploited. Mongol units advanced where resistance faltered, not in overwhelming waves, but in controlled movements designed to secure position and expanded incrementally. Once inside, the nature of the battlefield changed. The advantage of the defenders, height, fortification, preparation, was reduced. Engagement shifted into the interior of the city, where organization had already begun to degrade. What followed was not a prolonged urban defense.